Chapter 15. Not long after we returned from our trip to my brother's wedding, I realized I was pregnant. I wasn't exactly surprised. I was totally out of tune with my cycle, and I didn't know it all when I was fertile. It was something I hadn't even considered looking at. There's very little sex going on anyway. Paul seemed to only want to have sex when there was an element of risk to our lovemaking. He was keen if we were staying at someone's house or possibly had the chance of being caught. The more mundane, risk-free intimacy that I craved held no appeal to him. So it came as no surprise to me that Paul started to show signs of interest when we stayed in my parents' house in Virginia Beach after Sam's wedding. In fact, we slept in my parents' bed while they had set up camp in the freezing garage right next to the washing machine so that Paul and I could have some privacy with Asher. My parents were always like that, so considerate and generous and looking for opportunities to help others. After Paul came inside of me, he collapsed and said that he had seen a rainbow. He couldn't get over how beautiful this rainbow was. He talked about it for ages, and he knew that it meant that I was pregnant. I tried to brush it aside. Me being pregnant was sweet, but possibly not the best timing. Paul's drinking was escalating, and he was mentioning financial pressures more and more. The other thing that I tried to avoid thinking about, but I knew was very real, was the fact that Paul was incredibly jealous of my attention to Asher. Even though Paul adored his son and absolutely loved him, he really struggled with my attention being on our gorgeous little boy with a curious face instead of him. Most nights I would lie in bed, hot tears streaming down my face. I had never felt this alone, ever. And I was lying next to my husband. How could that be? How could I feel so terribly lonely and yet be next to someone? It didn't make sense. My head and chest were pounding. All I wanted was for my husband to reach out and touch me and show any indication that he cared for me. I craved to see that he valued and wanted me. Instead, he showed and did nothing. It was as if I had this black hole living in my home, sucking out all my emotions and energy. I wanted him so much, and I wanted to understand him, but he just sucked me dry. I was desperate for connection and desperate to explore my newfound sexuality. I was so lonely and craved friends. I decided to invite a couple over from the college. They were older than us, but I really liked them. Richard seemed familiar to me. He had that carefree spirit about him that reminded me of my friends back home. He was musical and playful and didn't equate being a Christian to not having a sense of humor. Richard and his wife Sonia came over and I tried to cook one of Liz's Arabic dishes, a combination of eggplant, cauliflower, diced lamb in layers, and then the rest of the pot is filled with rice. You cook it together and then flip it over on a plate and serve. It looked so easy when Liz made it. I flipped it over and it flopped. Totally flopped. The lamb was tough and undercooked, the eggplant soggy, the cauliflower hard. It was a total disaster. However, the conversation made up for it. Richard told us about a church that they went to, and he suggested that Paul and I come along. He explained that there were some young couples that we would like. I was so excited. A group of young people at a church. This was exactly what I needed. I told Paul later that night in bed that I wanted to go to the church. Paul wasn't so keen. He liked the freedom of visiting different churches where he could preach and then leave. He didn't feel the need to belong to something. I did. I needed to belong. I tried to explain that I needed friends. Paul told me that I already had friends. Alice and Sharon. I hardly ever saw Alice since she moved to Adelaide. She was living with her parents, raising her little daughter, who was only 4 weeks younger than Asher. Even though we had babies the same age, our paths hardly ever crossed. I only saw Sharon when I bumped into her at the college or when she came over to record music with Paul. I needed more. Paul said I had lots of friends at college. I did. I knew everyone and I was friendly with everyone, but that was different to belonging to a group. I really needed him to understand my loneliness. He tried to convince me that I was happy. I looked happy. I sounded happy. I was happy. He needed me to be happy. I realized as we spoke that there was no way Paul could face my sadness. My happiness was critical to his sense of self. The heaviness in my heart all of a sudden felt much bigger. I needed this church. I needed to connect with like-minded people. I told Paul that I had to go there. It took a few weeks, but we finally made it. It was Valentine's Day, 1999. I sat down in my seat and exhaled. I could see Richard at the front being part of the worship team. I looked around me. Just like he had promised, there were lots of young people. There were also lots of old people and kids running around. This felt very familiar. During the service, Asher was on my lap, but he kept looking over across the aisle. A little girl was sitting with her parents, similar age to Asher, but with big blue eyes and wispy blonde hair. They kept looking at each other, and eventually both managed to untangle themselves from their parents' arms and crawl out to each other. They met in the center of the aisle. A beam of light was shining through the ceiling window. It was picture perfect and so sweet. I looked across at the girl's mother and smiled. She smiled back. Thanks to Asher, I had my first friend, and I was thrilled that we would have someone to invite to his upcoming first birthday. My father had sent me a letter that just so happened to arrive the day after Asher's first birthday. A day where I spent most of my time trying to focus on not throwing up. We had gone to the zoo to celebrate Asher turning 1, and I had bought a sausage to eat. That sausage did not want to stay in my belly. It didn't feel pregnancy related. I never really had morning sickness as such. This just felt like a dodgy sausage that my body was rejecting. So when I opened the letter from my dad, the groundwork had already been done by the $2.50 snack at the zoo. I pulled out a photocopied piece of paper. My dad had scribbled something next to the heading, "The Vegan Gospel." It didn't exactly say that, but it might as well have. I'm not sure how many photocopy sheets he'd sent out to family and friends, but I assume it was as many as he could afford. My dad had his first convert. I only skimmed through the article. I had already decided I had converted to veganism. So there I was, a few months into my second pregnancy, still not fully recuperated from the first one, starting a new eating plan with absolutely no concept of what healthy food was. I just figured I needed to avoid anything that came from an animal. Easy. Unfortunately, my midwife made a comment about how babies will get the goodness they need from the mother no matter what she ate. And in my naive mind, I didn't fully grasp that Oriane didn't mean that I could survive on sandwiches and Skittles alone. That was pretty much what I lived on while being pregnant with my second baby. Paul was still wanting his meat so often he would order a piece of roast chicken and some chips if I was too tired to cook him a proper meal. Any energy I had was going to my husband and Asher. Eating a sandwich was much more convenient, and the Skittles helped where my energy levels got low. As my belly got bigger, Paul was spending more and more time at work. He loved what he was doing at the college. He loved teaching and writing curriculums and about chaplaincy. He also really enjoyed now being seen as one of the lecturers. I was thrilled for him, but also wished we could have more time together. We had moved to a more central location in Adelaide, so I spent a lot of time going for walks with Asher in his pram. One day while I was out, I saw Paul drive past. Once I got home, I said that we had seen him on the road. Just being silly, I asked if he'd noticed a sexy woman with a pram. Sexy? There's nothing sexy about a mother. I'd been trying to be funny, just something light-hearted to make conversation. I hadn't expected such a full-on response. Nothing sexy? Wow, I swallowed hard. That was not easy to hear. His words stung. Did he not realize I was now a mother for the rest of my life? Motherhood would never stop for me. If he didn't find me attractive now as a mother, he never would. I had never felt sexy, though. Paul's words were only really confirmed what I already felt. It just hurt to hear it. I was getting a lot of compliments from others, though. My vegan lifestyle and the sandwich and Skittle diet were working wonders. Weight was dropping off me. Each prenatal checkup proved that I was in fact losing weight, despite my pregnant belly growing bigger. I only noticed because the numbers had to be written down in a little book. I was so out of touch with my body that besides those numbers, I really didn't know what was happening to me. Except for one thing. I was starting to get severe throbbing in my legs. Varicose veins were appearing out of nowhere. Not just my legs either. As I got close to the end of my pregnancy, I was horrified to realize that varicose veins could exist in my groin as well. The pain was intense, and it made standing for long periods of time almost impossible. Things like doing dishes made me shift from foot to foot, hoping that it would ease the pain somewhat. I told my midwife about it, and she explained it was common. It didn't feel common. It felt like a fist was pounding me between my legs. The pain from the varicose veins, coupled with the pain from my lower back, was still lingering from Asher's birth, was enough incentive for me to go along to a chiropractic appointment that one of the couples at church had mentioned to me. I had never heard the word before, but the couple seemed so sweet and had offered to help me when they realized that we were on a very small income. Ken and Bryony had a chiropractic clinic in a beautiful old house. I felt safe with Ken, who was very gentle with my back and explained each maneuver. My biggest concern about the upcoming birth was not about the pain, though. I still had flashbacks from Asher's birth on a regular basis, normally as I was drifting off to sleep or when getting tired in the afternoon. No, my main concern was that what would happen to Asher when I was away in the hospital giving birth. He had hardly spent any time away from me in his now 18 months of life, and he was so attached to me. He fell asleep holding onto my hair, and the thought of him being left with someone else was very hard to fathom. The only person I could think of asking was Alice. Her voice was soothing, she had such a gentle nature with children, and I knew that she adored Asher. Despite how little we saw each other, I knew that she would be the easiest replacement for me. I was so grateful when she agreed, especially when I realized that she was going to leave her own daughter at home so she could fully focus on Asher. Once my due date was well and truly gone, Oriane gave me the words I had been dreading. The hospital couldn't wait any longer. I would need to be induced again. I had wanted to avoid this so much. I was given a date. I was not allowed to remain pregnant past October 10th. I like that number. 10 out of 10. Perfection. As it turned out, there was no sign of my baby wanting to come out. Ken, the chiropractor, had explained to me that I had a tilted pelvis, which meant that my baby's never quite engaged, and there wasn't enough pressure on my cervix. The hospital got their way and booked me in for an induction. Paul dropped me off at the hospital early in the morning and drove back to our house to be with Asher. We didn't want to keep Alice away from her daughter for any longer than was needed. Gel was inserted and the wait began. Nothing happened, so later in the afternoon, a second amount was added. This time I got a reaction. Instant pain in my legs. Both legs hurt, but the pain in my right leg was much worse. I tried to move around to try to ease the pain. As I sat on an exercise ball in the shower, I tried to use the force of the water on my leg as pressure. Nothing helped. It felt as if a boa constrictor had slid into the room and wrapped itself around my right leg and was squeezing its prey to death. Paul arrived at 4 p.m. with his Hebrew grammar books. Now that he'd been to Israel to visit, he was hoping to return there to study. Hebrew had replaced his Greek. As far as I was concerned, it was exactly the same. As I howled in the shower from the pain in my leg, I could see Paul through the doorway, reading his books and murmuring to himself. Not one offer of help. I knew he didn't like to give massages, but it would have really helped. Even if it wasn't a good one, just having someone there to reassure me and to know I wasn't alone. But I was. I was so alone. Tears were rolling down my cheeks, and I was wondering if I had made the wrong choice. Maybe I should have asked Paul to stay with Asher and asked Alice to help me instead. She would have been the perfect partner. Heat packs, cold face washers, sips of water, sitting with me in silence or telling me to breathe out the pain. By now, it felt as if I was going to explode. When Oriane came to check on me, I told her I was scared I would burst the vein in my groin. She told me not to worry and that it was common, but she would have a look. Her face said it all. This was really an extreme case of varicose veins. The pain in my leg and groin was incredibly intense. They hurt more than the contractions themselves. The tears streaming down my face, though, were not from the physical pain. They were from realizing that my husband was now watching 60 Minutes on TV. The news had finished and he was now moving on to another show. By now I was calling out and moaning from deep within me, and Oriane asked me to get on all fours out of reach of the shower. This time I had to push. A new sensation for me. Oriane called for Paul to join us. Already? That was quick. Quick? 4 hours might be quick when you're studying Hebrew and watching TV. 4 hours of having a boa constrictor squeezing your leg full force and having your groin about to explode is a very long time, especially when totally alone. I started to grunt. That ring of fire I had heard about was now making itself known. I pushed 3 times and my second baby slipped out of me and was handed to me between my legs. I held my baby close, so relieved it was all over. The baby was crying, not so much crying, but making sure I knew he wasn't happy about being forced out into the cold room. I looked down at him, and I looked again. It wasn't a boy. I had a girl. I couldn't believe it. I had a girl? A girl? How could I possibly have a girl? I had always seen myself as someone with sons. I was so used to male energy. Something in me must have assumed that I wasn't able to create a girl because I was so shocked at this little girl in my arms. I was in total awe that I could create a female. A girl, I have a girl. I kept saying it over and over again. And I kept saying it as my body started to shake and my teeth rattle. Heated blankets were now being wrapped around me to stop the shaking as I kept repeating my new mantra. I have a girl. I have a girl. She's beautiful, so beautiful. I looked closer and recognized her straight away. Her little face was etched by the same artist who made Murmur and my sister Susanna. The same mouth, so familiar. Paul said her name first. Tikva, hope, a Hebrew word that we'd made into a name. One night we had sat with the Hebrew dictionary and looked at words that could be made into names. When I suggested Tikva, Paul instantly wanted it. I hadn't really been serious. Paul fell in love with it and agreed to it since I figured that we would be having a boy anyway. I had hoped to call a girl I had hoped to call a girl Lillian after my grandmother. Looking at her in my arms, though, her name really suited her, Tikva. As we left the hospital the next morning, with Paul and Asher coming to collect us, one of the nurses exclaimed, "You got your pigeon pair!" I had never heard that term before. Pigeon pair. A boy and a girl. Your family is complete. No more babies for you.